Do you think that with Marcus Freeman, obviously a lot of programs wanted him. Notre Dame wanted to keep him, but was there? I'll ask this gently. Was this a panic hire to keep him from leaving?
Yeah, no, it wasn't. And so what understand is Jack Swarbrick kind of viewed Marcus as the successor to Brian Kelly. I just don't think Jack Swarbrick knew it was going to be after a year. I don't think anybody really knew Brian Kelly was going to leave that quickly, but we all knew Brian Kelly's time was coming to an end. And that's why Notre Dame, like Notre Dame did something with Marcus Freeman they've never done before, and that was they got into a bidding war to get him. They didn't do that just to have him as his defensive coordinator. There was always an end game in mind. And look, Luke Fickell expressed interest in the job. It never went to the point where would he take it or not. There was other coaches that Mike Campbell had expressed interest in the job. There's a couple other coaches I can't name that are big names that had expressed interest in the job. But it was just obvious to Jack Swarbrick that this is the guy. The players wanted him. The alumni loved him. He understands Notre Dame in a way that Brian Kelly never even tried to understand. And it's like, look, there's always a risk hiring a young coach, but I think there's enough evidence for Notre Dame in recent history, including Ohio State, including Oklahoma, Clemson with Dabo Swinney. We've seen a lot of guys kind of get their start on that big stage. We can say, look, we've seen it. As long as you put a good enough staff around him, he's got the chops, right? Because I think at the end of the day, guys, that's what I care about. I mean, we've seen veteran defensive coordinators, guys have been coaching a long time, come into a job and stink. We've seen young guys take over jobs and be good at it. If you got the chops, you got the chops. I've always believed that as a coach. But you think about who are the programs you're trying to be. You're trying to have the success of getting multiple playoffs like Oklahoma had with a head coach that had never been, who was in his 30s and never been a head coach before. Ohio State, and the tremendous run they've been on since Ryan Day got here, never been a head coach. I believe was in his 30s when he got the job, right? Dabo Swinney he'd never been a coordinator when he got the Clemson job, right? So now the situations are different in every instance. Dabo was replacing a coach that had failed. Lincoln and Ryan Day were replacing coaches that had succeeded. That's more in line with what Marcus Freeman's going through. So it was not a panic hire. Now, it may not be the right hire. We'll find that out in time, but it wasn't a panic hire. There was enough coaches that had expressed interest in the job. And Notre Dame had expressed interest in saying, hey, look, we don't really care about the Fiesta Bowl. The job here is to get the right hire. If we've got to wait till after the playoff to hire Luke Fickell, Notre Dame was more than ready to do that because at the end of the day, they were comfortable with that. It's just that after a second interview, it just was obvious that they felt Marcus Freeman was that guy. And so far, he's done a great job, right? I mean, you look at the staff he's put together. I mean, to me, that's the sign of, are you a mature coach? Is do you surround yourself with other really good coaches? I understand my weakness as a head coach is inexperience. So what am I going to do? I'm going to hire Al Golden, who's in his 50s, to run my defense, who's been a head coach, who's been in the NFL. You bring back Harry Hiestand, who's one of the best in the business at what he does. You bring in Jared Parker, who's got experience coaching the Big Ten. He was an interim head coach at Purdue, and he's somebody you trust. Al Washington, someone who a year ago people were talking about, maybe being a Tennessee defensive coordinator candidate. So he did a really tremendous job, in my opinion, of hiring a nice blend of young and older experienced coaches. So far, so good in regards to putting together his staff and building his team. Now we've got to see if he can motivate a team and get them in the right direction and go coach in game. That remains to be seen. But so far, I'm pleased with the job he's been able to do.
Yeah, because when it's the players and the alumni that choose the coach, there's all kinds of danger there. But I also see this more as the Bob Stoops handing it over to Lincoln Riley, Urban Meyer handing it over to Ryan Day. Like
they just have more class than Brian Kelly. That's the difference.
But when and Jack Swarbrick, when I would be okay with this guy taking over. I go back to I think 2016. I was at the Big Ten Media Days talking to Darrell Hazel. Marcus Freeman was the linebackers coach at Purdue at the time, and he said, because I was asking him about Marcus Freeman, former Buckeye, let's talk about him. And he's like, this guy is a future star. He's like, he's going to be a star in business. He's going to be a head coach, and it won't be too long. And then I was talking to Juwan Bentley, linebacker for Purdue at the time, and everything he told me about Marcus Freeman is everything that Marcus Freeman and James Laurinaitis had told me about Luke Fickell. They were the same person, the same kind of coach, and Marcus Freeman has learned from Luke Fickell, learned from Jim Tressel, and very different than Jim Tressel, very different than Brian Kelly in terms of care, I think, and in that respects and different.
And Marcus Freeman's a polar opposite of Brian Kelly in that regard.
Exactly. And that's somebody that everybody can get behind. I think it's also something that recruits can get behind. And I think that's where you've got an even more upside there. It's like, yes, we'll figure out how it goes on the field, but recruiting, it's hard to dislike Marcus Freeman, and it's not so hard to dislike Brian Kelly.
No, it's actually harder to like him. I mean, and that was when he was winning. I mean, Mark knows this. Mark, you've known me for a couple of years now. Even when Notre Dame was winning games, I just you know, he wasn't just because he's not a good guy. And that's the thing. It's like, you know, look, is Ryan Day as good of a head coach as Urban Meyer? He hasn't proven that yet. He doesn't have 3 titles, but he's a lot more likable. You know, it's just like, I can root for that guy. You know, I know a lot of people hate on Dabo. I like Dabo. I like Dabo a whole lot more than I like Nick Saban. He's just a more likable guy. But, you know, likability and all that at the end of the day is not going to win you a championship. And recruiting only takes you so far, right? And you know, for all the talent that Georgia's recruited and they've gotten to that state, if Alabama isn't down their 2 best receivers by halftime, they beat Georgia. I mean, with 15 draftable players, right? You know, get a little air quotes a little tighter here so y'all can see that. But I think you got to be able to coach, and that's what Marcus Freeman's got to prove. I mean, the recruiting thing, yes. I mean, look, Notre Dame's got the #1 recruiting class in the country right now. It's not even close. You know, they have 12 kids committed, and they're all 12 4 or 5 stars on the rivals rankings. I mean, I think 9 of their kids are ranked as like top 250 kids, and they're on the verge of, you know, potentially landing a few more big time players. So, you know, but now you got to go out and prove that you can coach, because the 23 class may be great because they're riding that wave of momentum. But if you don't prove you can coach, the 24 class won't build on that. And that, at the end of the day, that's what he's got to do. Is it's not that one great class. It's stringing great classes and really good classes on top of each other. And that ultimately only happens if you're able to show you can win.
I don't think there's any question that anyone that follows college football reasonably is impressed with Marcus Freeman, both from what he's produced on the field and then also just to hear him speak, and people gravitate to him. Young men gravitate to his leadership. But I got to admit, Brian, that I am a bit taken back at your level and other Notre Dame media level confidence that, okay, taking Brian Kelly, and despite a few warts on his resume, it's still a tremendous trajectory that he took this program on, the best since Lou Holtz. Just the unabashed elation over the hire of Marcus Freeman in replacing Brian Kelly.
Well, look, I think he's going to do a good job, but as I've said here, he's got to prove a lot, right? But here's the thing that drives me nuts about the love for Brian Kelly. Number one is anyone that followed the program and is an objective and honest person, not afraid to speak the truth, is going to tell you Brian Kelly wasn't even around half the time. I mean, I've heard this from former players, captains, guys in the NFL. He would meet us when we returned for January, and we wouldn't see him until spring ball started. And same thing would happen over the summer. They'd have to have all their recruiting weekends in one weekend because Brian Kelly's on vacation this week and that weekend, right? They won because, and as far as they said, well, look at the hires he made. Jack Swarbrick and Chad Klunder are the ones that drove the hires for Mike Elko and Chip Long. And then Mike Elko's the one that pushed to bring in Clark Lee because Brian Kelly was trying to leave Notre Dame at the time because they'd just gone 4-8. He wanted out. It was Swarbrick. And then when no one would hire him because you just went 4-8 against a terribly easy schedule where you lost a 3-9 Michigan State, 4-8 Duke, you know, and you go out there and you have that level of success. You say, well, he deserves all the credit. He was going to hire a strength coach from USC until Bob Diaco called him and said, you got to hire Matt Balis. Like, he was my guy at UConn. Look what he's done. We just got fired. You got to hire this guy. So it's like, well, what exactly should I give Brian Kelly credit for? And we say, well, Notre Dame went 32-5 the last 3 years. They went 3-5 against teams that finished in the year top 25. They went 11-2 this year. Now how many ranked teams they beat? Teams that were ranked at the end of the year? 0. They beat one ranked team in 2019. It was Navy. That's it, right? You don't get hired at Notre Dame to beat a bunch of nobodies. You get hired to beat the best teams in the country. Not only did they not beat the best teams in the country, they were usually not even competitive against the best teams in the country. And the only time they were was when Clemson didn't have Trevor Lawrence and their 3 best starters on defense. And they still needed double overtime to win that game, right? So that's why I have the disdain for Brian Kelly. He had no respect for Notre Dame and his traditions. He would constantly throw his players under the bus, right? Like it's his center's fault that he can't snap in a hurricane, not my fault that I kept going shotgun and calling pass plays in the middle of a hurricane, right? It's Deshaun Kaiser's fault or Justin Yoon's fault or my center's fault. He was like that his whole career. And he never gave credit to the people that deserved it, which was the coaches that were coaching their butts off and the players while he was out playing golf or shaking this person's hand or having this person tell him how wonderful he is. And that's why you saw such a universal acceptance of Marcus Freeman, because he's the anti-Brian Kelly. He cares about the kids. He loves Notre Dame and embraces Notre Dame. He's one of the most genuine coaches you're going to meet. And I'm sure Tony will tell you, there's not a lot of genuine coaches at this level. There's just not. You know, it's like Ohio State has one. You know, Tony Alford's one of my favorite coaches because love him or hate him, that's who Tony is, right? He is a genuine guy, and that's why I have so much respect for him. And that's how Marcus Freeman is. And that's why you see alums. They had 300 alums come back for the spring game, right? Notre Dame alums aren't all hanging out in northern Indiana, right? They're across the country, sometimes the world, because there's an excitement around Notre Dame because they actually feel like they have someone who gives a rip about them. I think that's why there's the acceptance, is because it's not even just about can he win or not. It's just, yeah, but it's just like sometimes, you know, you're winning, but there's just still this dark cloud around. You're not enjoying it. There's just this negativity. It's like I said this when Jim Harbaugh was with the Niners. I said the first bad season he has, they're going to be out because you better win because it's a miserable experience, and that's what Notre Dame went through. So maybe Marcus Freeman won't be able to coach. I don't know. But he's going to look out for his players. He's going to have their backs. He's going to love Notre Dame. And as we've seen, he's going to recruit his butt off. And as long as you have talent, you got a chance to win beat a bunch of teams. There's no doubt about it.
I also think he can be a lifer there and won't be looking for the next thing where, you know, Brian Kelly, you'd hear his name floated around every now and again. I am disappointed, though, with Marcus Freeman's turn to coaching, because when he was playing and James Laurinaitis were playing, and obviously James Laurinaitis' father was a professional wrestler, one of the two Road Warriors, they had talked about when their playing days were over, getting into wrestling and being a tag team. And I thought, you know, maybe those two guys could bring back the Road Warriors, the new generation of the Road Warriors. Now it's probably not going to happen, and it's a little bit disappointing.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I'm a child of, I don't know how old you are, but I'm in my mid-40s, so I grew up in that era, right? Mm-hmm. Road Warriors versus Demolition. So, yeah, that would have been fun to see. That'd have been fun to see. I'm actually, as a Notre Dame fan, I'm glad he didn't go down that route. Both of them didn't go down that route. I think it's going to pay off well for Notre Dame. But, yeah, I can, as an 80s child of the WWF, right? Yeah, I'm with you on that.